This is Myron, and this is Com 240. And today we are going to be discussing communication and culture more specifically. This is probably one of the more every chapter is obviously very important. You previously had saw chapter one, which was giving us bare bones information in terms of what communication is, and so now going forward, we are going to discuss communication and interpersonal communication, culture and communication. So first, we're going to define what culture is. We'll talk about enculturation, ethnic identity, acculturation, and why it's important. We'll also explain and give examples of the major ways that cultures differ from one another. And then lastly, we'll look at defining intercultural communication and what that means to have effective communication. I'm in chapter 2 of your textbook. It should be page 28 or somewhere in that vicinity. I know most of us should have the picture with the sea or the ocean on it. But if you do not, if you have the two coffee mugs like this one, you'll be totally fine. And so we're going to go ahead and begin and talk about culture. And I get it. A lot of people, oh, well, here we go. We got to talk about culture. Well, I want you to understand that culture is not about black or white or sex or sexuality or political affiliation. What culture is a specialized lifestyle of a group of people passed on from one generation to the next through communication and not genes. I want to emphasize it is not passed on through genes. Most of us tend to feel that way because we think it's hereditary, and that's not the case. Your culture is passed on through communication. Every group of people have these 7 things. Number one, everyone has values. Every single person has values, okay? None of our values are the exact same. We also have our beliefs. Some people believe in a God, some people do not believe in a God. Artifacts. Artifacts are things that we wear that communicate whether or not we are married, such as a wedding ring. Maybe some of us may have a tattoo or some type of insignia or some type of symbol that signifies something. We also have languages. Some of you all can speak multiple languages, some of us cannot. You also have ways of behaving. So think about, who you live with, okay? Does everyone brush their teeth like you? Does your roommate or partner or your husband or your wife, do they believe in cleaning up after themselves? Those are just basic cultural things that sometimes we take for granted. How about ways of thinking? Okay, not everyone thinks the exact same way. A lot of us have different ways of thinking. What may make sense for one person may not make sense for someone else, okay? And then we also have art, laws, and religion too as well, that affect all of us. So art meaning different types of music. For some of us, different types of laws, and then religion as well. If you were to go overseas, there are some communities where it's okay to have multiple spouses, okay? There are some places where you have to stay at home until you are married. So culture is a specialized lifestyle of a group of people passed on through communication and not genes. So let's take a look at a definition of sex and gender, if you will, okay? Sex is the biological distinction between male and female. This is what doctors assign all of us, okay? Gender are cultural roles which are deemed as masculine or feminine. So think of tasks that are done around the home. What would be considered masculine things or feminine? I know for me, I like to mow the lawn a lot. That's considered very masculine. Our neighbor, they just moved in recently, and they literally, the woman or the wife, she mows the lawn from time to time. So I wanted to be a jokester and say, hey, would you mow the lawn? Well, I said, not a chance. So there's things that in cultures, here's a Caucasian family, here's an African American family. What some things are deemed as masculine can be women and vice versa. Okay. So these are cultural roles. Think about this. When you think of, a chemistry teacher in high school, you probably think of a male, right? Although there's plenty of women that do it. Same thing if you think of a nurse. What would you think of? A woman probably. But how about a CPA? All right. So you get the gist there. So Gender stereotypes. The stereotype is that males are typically logical, decisive, aggressive, non nurturing, mechanically talented, and impatient. However, we typically say the stereotypes for women are illogical, variable, nurturing, emotional, sensitive, mechanically untalented, and patient. You know that there are men and women that fall crisscross to all of those stereotypes. So that's very important to pay attention to. I want you to focus on this side. This is enculturation versus acculturation. Enculturation is how your culture is transmitted from one generation to the next. And think about ethnic identity, if you will. Think about ethnic identity. Acculturation is how you learn the rules and the norms of your culture, which may be different than your native culture, such as being exposed to a new culture. So you may ask yourself, well, who in the world teaches us culture? Can ethnic identity cause ethnocentrism? And how has your culture been modified by contact with a different culture? Ethnocentrism, we'll talk about in a moment. But when we look at the far bottom left slide, you'll see that your first teachers are your parents, okay? Your parents or guardians are your first educators, and so that's where we get the term in terms of who teaches you culture. So here's some reasons. Oh, why do we got to talk? Well, what's this culture stuff? That's well, we're just a human race. I get it. I get it. I know where you're coming from. But there's five aspects that make up the cultural importance, okay? Here's the reason why. If you get an Amazon package sent to you, the chances are these things are coming from overseas, and more or less now with the whole pandemic, we are communicating online and remotely now, which causes everyone to have to interact with each other on a different basis, okay? Well, the first one is demographic changes. The world is changing, okay? People are dating and marrying people of different races, so you have a shift in demographic changes. Number two, there's a sensitivity to cultural differences as well. You have economic interdependence, which, as an economy in the United States, we all rely on a worldwide metric, if you will. Technology is huge right now. People are getting married off of dating people off phones and apps, and that's the way people date these days. If you were to ask someone 50 years ago, they would say there's no way in the world you could find your wife or your husband through a phone app. Culture specific nature of interpersonal communication as well. You don't need this slide, not applicable for us. So, cultural distinctions. These are what we call the 7 cultural distinctions. This is very, very important. You are going to want to revisit this. I'm on page 36 or in that vicinity. And these are what we call the 7 cultural distinctions or orientations. You have individualistic or collectivist, high context and low context, power structure, masculinity and femininity, tolerance for ambiguity, long term and short term, indulgence and restraint. You want to star this slide, it's very, very vital. So let's look at individualistic culture. If you are an individualistic and collective, let's take a look at individualism. You value the responsibility for the individual, okay? You focus on individual goals. Success is measured by individual accomplishment, and you are quite competitive, okay? There's nothing wrong. This doesn't mean that one cultural is one way and one's the other. But if you are an individualistic, it doesn't make you selfish. You just focus on individual goals. Success is measured by accomplishment, and you're competitive. So this is someone who probably hates to lose. This person is probably someone who believes in working and getting a job and earning a living. This is probably potentially someone who would be very worried if they were in a group project and had to work with other people, because potentially their grade could be at stake. Collectivist orientation or culture is where this person has a responsibility for the entire group. This person focuses on group goals, success is measured on contributions to the whole, and they do something called faith saving. So in collectivist groups, this is where they have a more harmonious outlook on a society, if you will, and there's a responsibility for the entire group. It's been argued that in the United States, women are more likely to view themselves as interdependents, having a more collectivist orientation, whereas you can imagine men possibly are independents, having more of an individualistic orientation. I can tell you right now, I've worked with women who were very, very competitive. I've worked with men who were, and the vice versa, men and women who have flip flopped. So, does your experience support this? High and low context cultures. If you come from a high context culture, this is where there's an emphasis on the information which is in the person. This person is typically collectivist, they value personal relationships. Oral agreements and messages can be vague because of shared knowledge. Okay, think of countries such as Latin America, Japanese, Arabic, Korean, and Mexican are examples of this. On the other end, low context cultures are very direct. And when you think of low context, this is the United States, Germany, the UK. The emphasis is on the information that is explicit. You rely on nonverbal cues. So if someone was a low context person, they're going to pay attention to what someone's wearing because that can communicate a whole lot. Messages can be very direct and specific. So let's take a look at masculine and feminine cultures. Masculine cultures are where men are valued for aggressiveness, material success. There's clear distinction of gender roles. There's ambition, assertiveness, competitive, and there's win-lose conflict strategies. When we look at win-lose conflict strategies, this is where someone wins and someone loses. However, when we look at feminine cultures, women are valued for modesty. There's a focus on quality of life and tenderness. There's less distinction between gender roles, and there's a focus on interpersonal relationships. Lastly, there is a win win conflict strategy there. So think in your own life and your environment, who is the person that's more feminine or masculine? Again, you can be a woman who's masculine and a man who is feminine. At different points in times, we've all fallen into these. So think about if there's an emergency. Would you prefer someone who's more masculine or feminine? Or what about if you're really struggling with anxiety or depression? Who would be more the one that would be more understanding who you should approach for advice or feedback? Both masculine and feminine cultures do value modesty, concern for the relationship, and quality of life. So both men and women do value modesty, concern for the relationship. So, oh, guys don't care. They don't care about me. No, we do. Guys do. It's just in a different way. And then you also look at quality of life. When we look at high power distance culture, this is where the power is in the hands of the few. Ordinary citizens have less power, and direct confrontation is viewed very negatively. So, can you think of a place that has a high power distant culture? Okay, this can be Mexico, Brazil, and also the Philippines. This is where you cannot question authority. Okay, think of North Korea as well. So if you're living with a roommate or someone and they have deference towards authority, etc., well, they're probably a high power distance because they view direct confrontation as viewed negatively. Low power distance cultures where the power is evenly distributed. Think of the United States and Western Europe. Equality that is consistent with assertive behavior. Okay, and so in low power distance, you know, the United States is kind of to a lesser extent, but think about how this could impact a classroom environment or relationships in general. So, high ambiguity tolerant cultures versus low ambiguity tolerant. High ambiguity tolerant cultures are where uncertainty is normal and expected. You are comfortable with the unknown. You minimize the importance of rules for relationships and communication, and you are very okay with vague or ambiguous details. Low ambiguity tolerant culture are where people avoid uncertainty. They want specific details. They are uncertain, or uncertainty is seen as a threat. There are clear rules in communication, and timelines are very, very important. So, just think, for example, you move into a new community and your neighbor is asking you a gazillion questions. Hey, what's your name? Where are you from? Where do you go to church? Where'd you go to college? Blah, blah, blah. Is that person high or low? You probably guessed it. That person is low. They are avoiding uncertainty. However, same scenario. You move into a new community and your neighbor never asks you anything and it is what it is. And, you and your spouse, spouse like, hey, some new people moved in. Oh, okay, Cool. Well, that person's probably high ambiguity. They're comfortable with the unknown, okay? They're okay with vague or ambiguous details. Same thing if you were to turn in an assignment. If you stress out about what you're getting, well, you are probably low ambiguity. But if you're okay with, hey, it is what it is, you're high ambiguity. Long-term and short-term orientation, okay? Long-term oriented cultures are where you have an importance of the future. We're planning and preparing for future results. Short-term orientation culture is where you focus on the past and the present, and these individuals expect quick results. So fast forward and think to, some, like you all are in college right now. So you're thinking long-term oriented, right? But for example, short term oriented are people who like quick results. So let's say I've gained 50 pounds. I am trying to lose weight. I say, you know what? I'm going to get the surgery, or I'm going to take pills, or I'm going to take Slim Fast. So you're going to take weight loss pills, Slim Fast. You don't want to work out. You're going to get the surgery and just be done with it. Well, there's no judgment here, but you're short term oriented. You want fast and quick results. However, a long term oriented person is probably someone who is saving for the future. So this person would have a larger 401k than probably someone who's short term. And it doesn't make one side good or the other. So think to your parents, was there a gratification of planning for the future, importance of the future? And then lastly, indulgence and restraint culture. Indulgence is what it is, and restraint is what it is. If you are starting with indulgent, you emphasize the gratification of desires. You focus on fun and enjoying life. There's a quote, living your best life. This is a person who, if they go to the club, they're buying drinks for everybody or beverages. However, someone who's restraint, this person is the person that probably, and there's no problem, just, no shade. This person isn't buying Air Force Ones or Jordans. This person will go to Walmart and buy the sale items. This is the person that is going to buy, to make their things very make things stretch, right? This is the person in the house. Where maybe if it was your mama or not, my grandmother was like this. She cut off all the lights after each room. Cut the light out, right? So these are people where they value thrift, social norms. They focus on group social norms. And the crazy thing here is restraint cultures have significantly higher rates of death due to cardiovascular disease, and they tend to be pessimistic. But people who are indulgent describe their health as very good. They have a great importance of friendships, and they value individual desire. So this is just a model here on how to improve your intercultural communication. Essentially here, just know that messages are interpreted based on our own cultural filters. So each and every one of us have our own filters in communication. So ways to improve your intercultural communication as we get ready to conclude. First, prepare yourself for those unique circumstances. Reduce your ethnocentrism, which is the tendency to view your culture as being the best or the absolute authority, if you will. Make sure you confront your stereotypes. We all suffer from this opportunity where stereotypes can be good and bad, and so how do you manage that? Be mindful of others, recognize that there are differences, adjust your communication, and recognize culture shock. So going back to ethnocentrism, again, you want to star this. This is very important as we conclude. This is the tendency to see others and their behaviors through your own cultural filters and to evaluate your own as superior. So be aware of cultural blinders and see others as different, but not being better or less than. Stereotypes. This is a fixed impression of a group of people, and barriers that cause stereotypes are ignoring the unique characteristics of an individual and failing to benefit from the individual's special contributions. So be mindful, use logic and critical thinking, recognize your differences and the fact that there are differences between you and the culturally different people. Adjust your communication, meaning when you're in different contexts and environments, you have to adjust and recognize culture shock. You want to star this one. This is very, very important. So, culture shock, as we conclude today, Culture shock is the psychological reaction you experience when you encounter a different culture. There are four stages to culture shock. The first stage is the honeymoon stage. This is when everything is going great, you are euphoric, you are enjoying life, and then a crisis happens. At the crisis stage, the differences between you and your culture, and then there's where there's a problem, if you will. So then you transition into the recovery, in which you recover from the situation and then you adjust. So let's think about this right now in terms of anything. You move into a new town. Everything is great. You've got a 3,000 square foot house. You've got an in ground pool, crown molding, vaulted ceilings. Everything is great. But then here's the crisis. You have a neighbor. Your neighbor has 6 dogs. The ordinance says you can only have, I don't know, two, right? So now it's a crisis. We didn't know they had dogs. So then the recovery. Oh, all right. Well, well, it is what it is. Or do you adjust? Do you put up a fence? Can you have a fence? So you can look at culture shock in so many different avenues. I'll use one more as an example. The honeymoon stage could be you're dating this person, and she or he is beautiful. They are the best thing. But then the crisis, they're on their phone late all the time. When you come in the room, they put their phone away. I went there, right? Then there's the recovery where you may ask them, hey, are you talking to your ex? Why are you not giving me time of day? And then the adjustment. Okay, I'm going to either continue in this relationship or I'm going to move on. So that concludes this week's video. This was Chapter 2, Communication and Culture, from Interpersonal Messages. I hope that you all found this information to be beneficial and hope that you can take this with you as you work on your coming assignments.